The moment I saw those termination papers on my desk, I knew my life was about to change forever. What I didn't know was just how much power a pregnant woman scorned could wield when she set her mind to complete and utter destruction. My name is Sarah, and 6 months ago I thought I had it all figured out. I was the top marketing director at Pinnacle Solutions, a mid-sized consulting firm that I'd helped build from a struggling startup into a multi-million-dollar success story. I'd been there for 8 years, pouring my heart and soul into every campaign, every client relationship, every late night that turned into early morning. I was good at what I did. No, I was exceptional, and everyone knew it. Especially my boss, Richard Blackwell. Richard was the kind of man who wore his success like an expensive cologne, overwhelming and impossible to ignore. 45, silver-haired, with the kind of practiced charm that made clients sign contracts and employees work unpaid overtime with a smile. He'd hired me straight out of business school, back when Pinnacle was just him, 2 other guys, and a dream of making it big in the corporate consulting world. For 8 years I'd been his right hand, his secret weapon. The person he called when a major client was on the fence, when a campaign needed that extra spark of brilliance, when the company's reputation hung in the balance. I'd saved his ass more times than I could count, and in return, he'd given me promotions, raises, and what I thought was genuine respect. I should have known better. The first sign something was wrong came 3 weeks after I'd shared the news about my pregnancy. It was a Thursday morning in March, and I was reviewing the quarterly performance reports when Richard called me into his office. The moment I walked in, I could feel the shift in the air, that subtle change in energy that happens right before someone delivers devastating news. "Sarah, please sit down," he said, not looking up from the papers scattered across his mahogany desk. My heart did a little skip. In 8 years, Richard had never asked me to sit down for good news. Good news was delivered standing up with handshakes and sometimes champagne. Sitting down meant budgets cuts, layoffs, or worse. "Is everything okay?" I asked, settling into the leather chair across from him. My hand instinctively moved to my still flat stomach, where our little miracle was growing, barely 12 weeks along. Richard finally looked up, and something in his expression made my blood run cold. This wasn't the man who'd mentored me, who'd fought for my raises, who'd trusted me with the company's most important accounts. This was a stranger wearing his face. "We need to talk about your situation," he said, the word situation dripping with distaste. "My situation?" I repeated, though we both knew exactly what he meant. "Your pregnancy, Sarah. We need to discuss how this is going to affect your role here at Pinnacle." The room felt like it was tilting. I gripped the arms of the chair, trying to steady myself. "Richard, you know I'm planning to take standard maternity leave. We discussed this. I've already started delegating some responsibilities," and he held up a hand, cutting me off. "It's not about maternity leave, Sarah. It's about commitment, about where your priorities are going to be moving forward." "My priorities?" The words came out as barely a whisper. "Let's be honest here. Once that baby comes, you're not going to be the same employee you were before. Late nights, client dinners, weekend strategy sessions. All of that becomes secondary when you have a child to think about. And frankly, our clients deserve better than someone who's only half committed to their success." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, for the moment when he'd crack a smile and tell me this was some kind of sick joke. But his expression remained coldly professional, like he was discussing quarterly projections instead of dismantling my career. "You can't be serious," I managed to say. "I'm completely serious, Sarah. We're restructuring the marketing department, and your position is being eliminated." The word hit me like a physical blow. Eliminated. Not transferred, not modified, not put on temporary hold. Eliminated. "You're firing me," I said, the reality of it crashing over me in waves. "We're eliminating your position due to company restructuring," he corrected, as if the corporate speak would somehow soften the blow. "Of course, we'll provide you with a generous severance package, and I'll be happy to serve as a reference for future opportunities." Future opportunities. As if any reference from him would be worth the paper it was printed on after this. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something. I wanted to tell him exactly what I thought of his restructuring and his generous severance. Instead, I sat there in stunned silence, my mind reeling with the implications of what was happening. 8 years. 8 years of 16-hour days, of skipped vacations, of putting this company before my own health and happiness. 8 years of making Richard look good, of covering for his mistakes, of being the backbone of this company's success. And this was how he repaid me. When? I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Today will be your last day. Security will escort you out after you've gathered your personal belongings. Security? Like I was some kind of criminal who might steal company secrets on my way out. The humiliation was almost worse than the betrayal. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling like they were made of jelly. I see. Sarah, I want you to know this isn't personal. It's just business. I turned to look at him one last time, memorizing every detail of his face, the way his eyes avoided mine, the slight twitch in his jaw that betrayed his discomfort, the expensive watch glinting on his wrist, a watch I'd helped him afford with my brilliant campaigns and tireless dedication. Of course it isn't, I said quietly. It never is it? I walked out of his office with my head held high, even though inside I was crumbling. The next hour passed in a blur of packing boxes, avoiding eye contact with colleagues who were suddenly very interested in their computer screens, and trying not to cry until I was safely out of the building. The security guard, a kind older man named Frank who'd always greeted me with a smile, looked genuinely pained as he walked me to my car. "I'm sorry, Miss Chen," he whispered as we reached the parking garage. "This doesn't seem right." It wasn't right. Nothing about this was right. I sat in my car for 20 minutes after Frank went back inside, staring at the building that had been my second home for nearly a decade. The tears finally came then, hot, angry tears that left mascara streaks on my cheeks and made my chest ache with the force of my sobs. How was I going to tell David? My husband was going to be devastated, not just by the financial implications, but by the sheer injustice of it all. He'd been so proud when I'd gotten the promotion to marketing director, had bragged to his friends about his wife who was climbing the corporate ladder like it was child's play. How was I going to explain that all of that success, all of that hard work, meant nothing the moment I dared to create new life? The drive home was a blur of stoplights and racing thoughts. Our mortgage, the baby preparations, the nursery we'd just started planning, everything suddenly felt uncertain. But underneath the fear and the practical concerns, something else was growing, something dark and determined. Rage. By the time I pulled into our driveway, the tears had stopped. By the time I walked through our front door, the fear had crystallized into something much more dangerous. I was going to make Richard Blackwell pay for what he'd done. I just didn't know how yet. David took the news exactly as I'd expected, with a mixture of outrage and immediate protectiveness that made me love him even more. He spent the evening pacing our living room, ranting about wrongful termination lawsuits and discrimination laws, while I sat curled up on the couch with a cup of herbal tea, letting his anger wash over me. But David's anger was hot and immediate. Mine was cold and calculating. "We should call a lawyer first thing tomorrow," he said for the third time, running his hands through his dark hair. "This is textbook pregnancy discrimination. We have a solid case." "Maybe," I replied, though I was already thinking beyond lawsuits and legal settlements. "Maybe? Sarah, they can't fire you for being pregnant. It's illegal." "They didn't fire me for being pregnant," I said quietly. "They eliminated my position due to company restructuring." Richard was very careful about his wording. David stopped pacing and stared at me. "You can't seriously be defending him." "I'm not defending him. I'm just saying he's smarter than we think. Richard didn't build a multi-million-dollar company by accident. He knows exactly how to skirt the edge of employment law without crossing the line." The truth was, I'd spent the entire drive home thinking about Richard's strategy. The timing, the corporate speak, the way he'd framed it as a business decision rather than a personal one. He'd probably consulted with the company's legal team before calling me into his office. Everything about the termination had been calculated to minimize legal exposure. But what Richard didn't understand was that I'd been paying attention all these years. I knew how the company operated, how the finances worked, where the bodies were buried. And unlike him, I wasn't interested in playing by the rules. That night, after David had finally exhausted himself with righteous indignation and fallen asleep, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and thinking, planning. The initial shock and hurt were giving way to something much more useful: strategic thinking. I'd always been good at solving problems. It's what made me such an effective marketing director. Give me a challenge, and I'd find a way to turn it into an opportunity. Give me a competitor, and I'd find their weakness and exploit it. Give me a seemingly impossible deadline, and I'd work miracles to make it happen. Richard Blackwell had just become my biggest challenge yet. Over the next few days, I threw myself into research with the same intensity I'd once reserved for client campaigns. I started with the obvious: employment lawyers, wrongful termination cases, discrimination settlements. David was right that we had options, but as I dug deeper into the legal precedents, I realized he was also wrong about our chances of success. Richard had been smart, frustratingly, calculatedly smart. The company had documented several performance concerns in my file over the past 3 weeks, all minor issues that wouldn't have warranted a second glance under normal circumstances, but which now formed a convenient paper trail. A client meeting that ran 5 minutes over schedule, a report that was submitted at 5:02 p.m. instead of 5 p.m., a typo in an email that had already been corrected. None of it was serious. All of it was designed to provide cover for his decision. But as I researched Richard's strategy, I stumbled across something much more interesting than employment law. I found Pinnacle Solutions' financial records. Public companies have to disclose their financial information, but Pinnacle was privately held. Getting access to their real numbers should have been impossible for an outsider. Should have been, but I wasn't really an outsider, was I? I'd been on the inside for 8 years. I knew where the bodies were buried. More importantly, I knew where Richard kept his passwords. It's amazing how careless people become with sensitive information when they trust you. For years, I'd watched Richard log into various systems, had helped him recover forgotten passwords, had even filled out financial forms on his behalf when he was traveling. I'd seen his social security number, his mother's maiden name, his first pet's name, all the little details people use to secure their digital lives. I'd also seen him write down passwords on sticky notes that he kept in his desk drawer. The man who'd just destroyed my career over a few typos and minor scheduling conflicts was keeping the keys to his financial kingdom on a piece of paper in his desk. It took me 3 days to work up the courage to use what I knew. 3 days of staring at my laptop screen, wondering if I was really the kind of person who would hack into her former employer's systems for revenge. 3 days of David asking how the job search was going while I smiled and lied about sending out resumes. On the 4th day, I decided I was exactly that kind of person. The first password I tried didn't work. Neither did the second. But the third, a combination of his daughter's name and birth year, opened up Pinnacle's financial dashboard like a digital treasure chest. What I saw there made my hands shake with more than just nervousness. Pinnacle Solutions wasn't the thriving company Richard presented to the world. They were hemorrhaging money. Had been for months. 3 major clients had pulled their contracts in the past quarter, and 2 more were threatening to leave. The company was in serious financial trouble, but that wasn't the most interesting part. The most interesting part was the real reason behind my elimination. Richard wasn't restructuring the marketing department to improve efficiency. He was desperately trying to cut costs to keep the company afloat. My salary, along with the salaries of 4 other employees who'd been eliminated in the past month, was being redirected to pay off creditors and keep the lights on. My pregnancy hadn't made me a liability. It had made me expensive. Maternity leave meant paying me while also paying for temporary coverage. In Richard's cold calculation, I'd become a luxury he couldn't afford. The betrayal cut even deeper than I'd thought possible. It wasn't just that he'd fired me for being pregnant. It was that he'd fired me to save money, then lied about it to avoid taking responsibility for his failing business. But as I dug deeper into the financial records, I discovered something else, something that made my heart race with possibilities I'd never considered before. Pinnacle Solutions was for sale, not publicly, of course. Richard would never admit that his empire was crumbling. But there it was, buried in email chains and financial projections, discussions with business brokers, valuations, meetings with potential buyers. The company I'd helped build, the company that had just discarded me like a broken piece of machinery, was desperately looking for someone to bail them out. And suddenly, I knew exactly how I was going to get my revenge. The idea was insane. Completely, utterly insane. I was an unemployed pregnant woman with a mortgage and growing medical bills. I didn't have the kind of money it would take to buy a multi-million-dollar company, but I knew someone who did. My father-in-law, Chen Wei, had built a small empire in commercial real estate over the past 30 years. He'd started with nothing, an immigrant who'd worked 3 jobs to put himself through night school, and turned himself into one of the most successful property developers on the West Coast. He was also one of the most generous people I'd ever known, especially when it came to family. David and I had always been independent. We'd bought our house with our own money, paid our own bills, never asked his parents for anything beyond the occasional dinner invitation. But this wasn't about asking for a handout. This was about presenting a business opportunity. The more I studied Pinnacle's financial situation, the more convinced I became that it could work. The company wasn't failing because of bad fundamentals, it was failing because of bad management. Richard had gotten complacent, had lost focus, had let personal relationships with clients deteriorate while he focused on his golf game and expensive lunches. The underlying business was still sound. The reputation, while tarnished, could be rebuilt. The client base, while diminished, could be recovered. What Pinnacle needed wasn't a burial, it needed a resurrection. And I knew exactly how to bring it back from the dead. That evening, I called David into our home office and laid out everything I'd discovered. The financial records, the real reason for my termination, the company's desperate search for a buyer. "You hacked into their system?" he asked, his voice a mixture of admiration and concern. "I used information I already had legitimate access to," I corrected. "Technically, Sarah." "David, listen to me. This isn't just about revenge, though I'll admit that's part of it. This is about opportunity. Pinnacle is bleeding money because Richard doesn't know how to run a modern consulting business. But I do. I've been running that marketing department like my own company for years. I know every client, every process, every weakness that needs to be addressed." I pulled up the financial projections I'd been working on for the past 2 days. "Look at these numbers. With proper management and a focused turnaround strategy, Pinnacle could be profitable within 6 months. Within 2 years, it could be worth triple what they're asking." David studied the spreadsheets, his business degree kicking in as he analyzed the data. "These projections assume you can win back the clients they've lost." "I can," I said with absolute certainty. Richard burned those bridges, but the clients weren't angry with Pinnacle. They were angry with him. They trusted me. If I'm running the company, I can rebuild those relationships. "And you want to ask my father to finance this?" "I want to present your father with a business opportunity that happens to come with the most satisfying revenge in corporate history." David was quiet for a long moment, processing everything I'd shown him. Finally, he looked up at me with something that might have been respect. "You've really thought this through, haven't you?" "I've thought about nothing else for days." "And you're sure Richard has no idea you know about the financial troubles?" "He thinks he's been clever. The company's been putting on a good front, still paying bills, still operating normally. From the outside, it looks like business as usual. Even the employees don't know how bad things really are." David leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. "So Richard thinks he's just dealing with a disgruntled former employee who might cause some minor legal troubles, while I'm actually planning to buy his entire company out from under him. Jesus, Sarah, this is either brilliant or completely insane. Why can't it be both?" That weekend, we drove up to San Francisco to have dinner with David's parents. I'd been nervous about the conversation, but Chen Wei listened to my proposal with the same focused intensity he brought to all his business dealings. He asked probing questions about market conditions, competitive landscape, and financial projections. He wanted to see the data behind my claims, the evidence supporting my strategy. I'd prepared for all of it. By the end of the evening, I had a potential partner. Not just a father-in-law who felt sorry for his pregnant daughter-in-law, but a genuine business partner who saw the opportunity I was presenting. "I've been looking for ways to diversify beyond real estate," he told me as we sat in his study after dinner. "Consulting services, especially in the tech sector, represent a growing market with strong margins. If you're confident you can execute this turnaround." "I am," I said. "Give me 6 months and I'll prove it." He studied me for a long moment, and I could see him evaluating not just my business plan but me as a person. Was I someone he could trust with a multi-million-dollar investment? Was I someone who could deliver on my promises? "There's one condition," he said finally. "What's that?" "This has to be a legitimate business acquisition, not just an expensive revenge plot. If we do this, we do it right. Professional. By the book. No cutting corners, no questionable tactics. Just good business." I nodded, though privately I was already planning how to make Richard's termination as professionally humiliating as possible. "I understand," I said. "Good. Then let's talk about putting together an offer." The next 3 weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Chen Wei connected me with his business attorney, his accountant, and a team of financial analysts who could conduct proper due diligence on Pinnacle's books. We structured the deal through one of his holding companies, keeping my involvement completely hidden from Richard and his team. As far as Pinnacle knew, they were dealing with Chen Holdings, a successful real estate investment firm looking to diversify into consulting services. Richard probably thought he'd hit the jackpot, a wealthy buyer with deep pockets and no direct knowledge of the consulting industry. Easy money. The irony was delicious. While the legal and financial teams handled the formal aspects of the acquisition, I focused on the strategic planning. I reached out quietly to former colleagues who'd been laid off, gauging their interest in returning under new management. I researched the clients who'd recently left, analyzing exactly what had gone wrong and how it could be fixed. I developed detailed plans for every aspect of the company's operations, from marketing strategy to internal culture. By the time we were ready to make an offer, I had a complete blueprint for Pinnacle's resurrection. The offer came in on a Tuesday morning in late April. I wasn't supposed to know about it. Officially, I was just David's pregnant wife, sitting at home and job hunting. But Chen Wei kept me informed about every step of the process. Richard was ecstatic. The offer was for exactly what his business brokers had suggested the company was worth, with minimal contingencies and a fast closing timeline. Chen Holdings appeared to be the kind of buyer every struggling business owner dreams of: serious, well-funded, and eager to close. During the negotiation phase, I had to resist the urge to insert little personal touches into the deal terms. I wanted to include clauses about management changes, about employee treatment, about ethical business practices. But Chen Wei was right. This had to be legitimate business, not personal vendetta. There would be time for personal touches later. The due diligence process took 2 weeks. Chen Wei's team went through Pinnacle's books with surgical precision, uncovering every detail of the company's financial situation. They found things even I hadn't discovered in my initial research: deferred payments to vendors, creative accounting that masked the true extent of the cash flow problems, contracts that were far less favorable than they appeared on the surface. Any rational buyer would have walked away. But we weren't rational buyers. We were strategic buyers with a specific plan and the resources to execute it. On May 15th, exactly 2 months after Richard had fired me, Chen Holdings officially acquired Pinnacle Solutions for $3.2 million. Richard signed the papers with a smile on his face, probably thinking he'd just pulled off the business deal of a lifetime. He'd managed to offload a failing company for full market value to buyers who seemed blissfully unaware of the challenges they were inheriting. I watched the signing ceremony via video conference from Chen Wei's office, my heart pounding with anticipation. Richard looked relaxed, confident, even a little smug as he signed document after document, transferring ownership of his life's work to strangers. He had no idea that in 24 hours, his life was going to change forever. The transition plan we'd negotiated was standard for acquisitions of this type. Richard would stay on for 30 days to ensure smooth handover of operations, after which he'd transition to a consulting role for an additional 90 days. During the handover period, Chen Holdings would gradually introduce new management and strategic direction. What Richard didn't know was that I'd been appointed as the new chief executive officer, effective immediately upon closing. My first day as CEO of Pinnacle Solutions began at 6 a.m. on May 16th. I arrived at the office before anyone else, using the key codes that were now legally mine, and settled into the executive conference room to prepare for the most important meeting of my life. At 8 a.m. sharp, I called Richard and asked him to join me in the conference room for a strategic planning session with the new ownership team. He arrived 15 minutes later, looking slightly confused, but still wearing that confident smile. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" "Good morning, Richard," I said, standing up from the head of the conference table. "Please have a seat." He hesitated, his business instincts finally starting to kick in. Something about the setup wasn't right. The way I was positioned at the head of the table, the formal tone in my voice, the stack of documents arranged in front of me. "I don't understand," he said slowly. "Are you working with Chen Holdings now?" "In a manner of speaking," I replied. "Actually, I am Chen Holdings." "Well, my father-in-law is Chen Holdings, but I'm the operating partner for this particular investment." The confusion on his face was beautiful. I could actually see the moment when understanding began to dawn, when the implications of what I was saying started to sink in. "That's impossible," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Is it? Let me explain." I picked up the first document from the stack. "This is the acquisition agreement you signed yesterday. As you can see, it transfers 100% ownership of Pinnacle Solutions to Chen Holdings, effective immediately." I moved to the second document. "This is my appointment as Chief Executive Officer, also effective immediately." The third document. "And this is your termination notice, Richard. Your services are no longer required." The silence in the room was profound. Richard stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language, his brain struggling to process what was happening. "You can't be serious," he said finally. "I'm completely serious. Just like you were completely serious when you fired me for being pregnant 2 months ago." "I didn't fire you for being pregnant," he protested, falling back on the same corporate speak he'd used before. "We eliminated your position due to company restructuring." "Right. Just like I'm eliminating your position due to company restructuring." He stood up abruptly, his face flushing red. "This is ridiculous. You can't just buy a company to get revenge on someone." "Actually, I can. It's called capitalism, Richard. Supply and demand. You had something for sale, I had the money to buy it. It's just business." The phrase hit him like a slap. I could see him remember saying those exact words to me 2 months ago, could see him realize that I was throwing his own justification back in his face. "This is vindictive and petty," he said. "No, Richard. This is strategic business planning. You see, Pinnacle was failing under your leadership. Hemorrhaging clients, burning through cash, cutting essential personnel to stay afloat. What I've done is acquired an undervalued asset with significant turnaround potential. I pulled out another document, my comprehensive business plan for Pinnacle's resurrection. Over the next 6 months, I'm going to rebuild the client relationships you destroyed, rehire the talented employees you laid off, and restore this company to profitability. And I'm going to do it all while being very, very pregnant." Richard's face went through several color changes as the full scope of what was happening finally hit him. This wasn't just about his job. This was about his entire professional legacy being handed over to the woman he'd betrayed. "You won't succeed," he said, though there was desperation in his voice now. "This business is harder than you think. You don't understand the challenges." "I understand them perfectly," I interrupted. "I understand them because I've been solving them for 8 years while you took credit for my work. The difference is, now I'll be solving them as the owner instead of as your employee." He tried several more arguments, threats of legal action, claims about contracts and non-compete agreements, appeals to what he called professional courtesy, but every avenue he explored led to the same dead end. The acquisition was legal, my appointment was valid, and his termination was effective immediately. Finally, he played his last card. "What about the baby?" he asked. "How are you going to run a company while raising a child? You said yourself that motherhood changes your priorities. You won't be able to give this the attention it needs." I smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd allowed myself since walking into the office that morning. "You're absolutely right, Richard. Motherhood will change my priorities. But unlike you, I actually understand what leadership means. It means building systems that don't depend entirely on the boss. It means developing teams that can function independently. It means creating a company culture that values all employees, not just the ones who happen to remind you of yourself." I stood up and walked around the table to where he was sitting. "Most importantly, it means treating people with basic human decency, something you apparently never learned." The security guard who escorted Richard from the building wasn't Frank. He'd been laid off the previous month as part of Richard's cost-cutting measures. But I made sure Frank was the first person I called back when I started rebuilding the team. By noon on my first day as CEO, news of the acquisition had spread throughout the office. The employees who remained were a mixture of confused, hopeful, and terrified. Many of them remembered me, of course, but my sudden transformation from terminated employee to company owner was difficult for anyone to process. I called an all-hands meeting for 2 p.m. and spent the lunch hour preparing my remarks. This wasn't just about introducing myself as the new boss. This was about laying the foundation for everything that would come next. The conference room was packed. 43 employees, everyone who'd survived Richard's layoffs, crowded into a space designed for 30. Some sat on the floor, others leaned against the walls. The energy in the room was electric with anticipation and anxiety. "Good afternoon, everyone," I began, standing at the front of the room where Richard had delivered so many uninspiring pep talks over the years. "I know you're all wondering what's going to happen next, so I'm going to be completely honest with you." I paused, looking around the room at faces I'd worked alongside for years. These were good people who'd been caught in the crossfire of Richard's incompetence. They deserved better. This company has been struggling, losing clients, cutting costs, operating in crisis mode for months. Under the previous leadership, that might have continued until there was nothing left to save. But I'm not the previous leadership. A few people shifted uncomfortably. They remembered the last time I'd been in this building, remembered watching security escort me out. Some of you might be wondering how I went from terminated employee to company owner in 2 months. The answer is simple. I saw an opportunity and I took it. Richard taught me that business is just business, nothing personal. So I treated this as a business opportunity, nothing more. That got a few nervous chuckles from the audience. Here's what's going to happen next. Over the next 30 days, I'm going to be reaching out to every client we've lost, every vendor we've alienated, every employee who was laid off. I'm going to apologize for the mistakes of the past and present a vision for the future. Some of those conversations will go well, others won't. But I'm going to try to rebuild every relationship that can be rebuilt. I clicked to the first slide of my presentation, a timeline showing the company's projected recovery. I'm also going to be transparent with all of you about our financial situation. We have approximately 4 months of operating capital remaining. That might sound scary, but it's actually plenty of time if we execute properly. Within 90 days, I expect us to be cash flow positive again. Within 6 months, I expect us to be genuinely profitable. More slides followed, organizational changes, new policies, investment in employee development and benefits. There will be changes, yes, but unlike the changes of the past few months, these changes are designed to build something sustainable rather than just cut costs. We're going to be hiring, not firing. We're going to be investing in our people and our capabilities, not just trying to survive another quarter. When I finished the presentation, the room was quiet for a long moment. Then Jennifer from the design team raised her hand. What about the people who were laid off? Are you really going to try to bring them back? I'm going to offer positions to every single person who was terminated over the past 6 months, assuming they're interested in returning. That includes support staff, account managers, and yes, even some former executives who I believe were unfairly blamed for Richard's strategic failures. Another hand went up. What about you being pregnant? How is that going to affect your ability to run the company? It was a fair question, though I noticed several people wince when it was asked. The pregnancy discrimination that had started this whole chain of events was still fresh in everyone's mind. I'm due in November, I said calmly. I'll be taking standard maternity leave when the time comes, during which operations will be managed by the deputy CEO I'll be hiring over the next month. When I return, I'll be working a modified schedule that allows me to balance family responsibilities with business leadership. I paused, looking directly at the person who'd asked the question. The difference between me and the previous leadership is that I understand the value of building systems that don't depend entirely on one person's presence. A well-run company should be able to function effectively whether the CEO is in the office 14 hours a day or taking time off to care for a new baby. That got some nods of approval from around the room. The questions continued for another 30 minutes, covering everything from salary changes to strategic direction to company culture. I answered everything as honestly as I could, acknowledging what I knew and admitting what I was still figuring out. But the underlying message was clear: things were going to be different. When the meeting ended, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not just for my own situation, but for the company itself. These were talented people who'd been poorly led and under-resourced. Given proper support and direction, they could accomplish remarkable things. As employees filed out of the conference room, several stopped to speak with me personally. Some offered congratulations, others asked specific questions about their roles. A few simply said they were glad to see me back. The last person to leave was Marcus Chen, no relation to my husband's family, a senior account manager who'd been with the company almost as long as I had. He lingered near the door until everyone else was gone, then walked back over to where I was gathering my presentation materials. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I want you to know that a lot of us never believed Richard's story about why you were let go. The timing, the circumstances, it didn't add up. Thank you for saying that, Marcus. Also, I want you to know that what you've done here, buying the company, firing Richard, taking over as CEO, it's the most badass thing I've ever seen in corporate America." I couldn't help but laugh. I'm not sure badass is the image I want to project as CEO. Maybe not publicly, he said with a grin. But privately? Hell yes. After Marcus left, I sat alone in the conference room for several minutes, processing everything that had happened. In the span of 8 hours, I'd gone from unemployed victim to corporate executive. I'd terminated my former boss, presented a turnaround plan to his employees, and begun the process of rebuilding a company from the ground up. It should have felt overwhelming. Instead, it felt like coming home. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "How did it go?" I typed back, "Richard has been eliminated due to company restructuring." His response was immediate: "I love you so much." The next few weeks were a blur of 18-hour days, despite Chen Wei's constant reminders that I needed to take care of myself and the baby. There was simply too much to do and not enough time to do it. First priority was stopping the bleeding, reaching out to clients who were considering leaving, reassuring vendors who hadn't been paid on time, stabilizing the day-to-day operations that had been neglected during the acquisition process. Second priority was rebuilding the team. I reached out to every person who'd been laid off over the past 6 months, starting with the most recent terminations. The conversations were awkward at first. Many of them had heard about Richard's firing and my role in the acquisition, but few understood the full story. I decided to be completely transparent. I was fired for being pregnant. I told each of them during our individual meetings. Richard used company restructuring as cover, but the real reason was that he saw my maternity leave as an unnecessary expense. When I discovered that the company was for sale, I decided to buy it and implement some restructuring of my own. The reactions varied. Some were shocked by the revelation about Richard's discrimination. Others were impressed by my strategic response. A few were concerned about the ethics of what I'd done, but almost all of them were interested in returning. Within 3 weeks, I'd rehired 12 of the 16 people who'd been laid off. The other 4 had already found new positions and were happy where they were, which I completely understood. The hardest conversation was with Patricia Nguyen, who'd been Richard's executive assistant for 7 years before being terminated due to budget constraints. Patricia had known about my pregnancy before anyone else. She'd been the one to handle my medical appointment scheduling, had noticed my morning sickness, had even brought me ginger tea when I was feeling nauseous. She'd also been the one to schedule the meeting where Richard fired me. "I'm so sorry, Sarah," she said when I called to offer her job back. "I knew what he was planning, but I couldn't warn you without risking my own position." I felt terrible about it. "Patricia, you don't need to apologize. You were trying to protect your job. I understand that completely. But if you'd said something, Richard would have fired you too, and I still would have ended up in the same situation. The only difference is that you would have suffered along with me." She was quiet for a moment. "You really bought the entire company just to fire him?" "I bought the company because it was a good investment opportunity. Firing Richard was just a pleasant bonus." Patricia laughed then, the first genuine laugh I'd heard from her in years. "When do you want me to start?" With the team rebuilding process underway, I turned my attention to the clients. This was the make-or-break element of the turnaround plan. Pinnacle could have the best employees in the world, but without clients to serve, none of it mattered. The first call I made was to Janet Morrison at TechFlow Dynamics, the largest client Richard had lost. Janet and I had worked together for 4 years on their digital marketing campaigns, and I knew she'd been frustrated with Richard's increasingly hands-off approach to their account. "Sarah?" she said when I identified myself. "I heard Richard was no longer with Pinnacle, but I didn't realize you were back." "I'm not just back, Janet. I'm running the company now." "You're running Pinnacle? How did that happen?" I gave her the abbreviated version of the story, focusing on the business aspects rather than the personal drama. I saw an opportunity to acquire an undervalued company with strong fundamentals and significant turnaround potential. The previous management had lost focus, but the underlying business is still sound. "And you fired Richard?" "I eliminated his position due to company restructuring." Janet was quiet for a moment, then burst out laughing. "Oh my God, Sarah, that's incredible. He actually fired you, and then you bought the company and fired him back?" "Something like that. That's the most amazing thing I've ever heard in business. And honestly, it gives me a lot more confidence in Pinnacle moving forward." Richard had become impossible to work with over the past year. Arrogant, dismissive, completely out of touch with what we actually needed. By the end of our conversation, TechFlow Dynamics was back as a Pinnacle client. The pattern repeated itself over the following weeks. Client after client told similar stories about Richard's declining performance, his failure to understand their needs, his increasing focus on his own ego rather than their success. But they remembered me. They remembered the campaigns I'd created, the problems I'd solved, the extra effort I'd put in to make their businesses successful. When I explained that I was now in charge of Pinnacle's strategic direction, most of them were eager to give the company another chance. Within 6 weeks of taking over as CEO, I'd won back 4 of the 5 major clients Richard had lost. The 5th client, Peterson Industries, was a different story. Their CEO, Robert Peterson, had been Richard's golf buddy and fishing partner. Their relationship was personal as much as professional, and Robert took Richard's termination as a personal betrayal. "I don't care how qualified you are," he told me during our phone conversation. "What you did to Richard was unconscionable. Buying a company just to fire someone? That's not business, that's revenge. Mr. Peterson, I understand your loyalty to Richard, and I respect that. But I hope you'll also consider the facts about Pinnacle's performance under his leadership. Your account was consistently underserviced, your campaigns were underperforming industry benchmarks, and your concerns were repeatedly dismissed. Richard was going through a difficult time. The company was facing challenges. Yes, it was. And rather than address those challenges directly, Richard chose to cut costs by eliminating his most valuable employees while protecting his own position. That's not leadership, Mr. Peterson. That's self-preservation at the expense of everyone else." The conversation ended without resolution, and Peterson Industries remained with their new consulting firm. It stung, but I had to accept that some bridges couldn't be rebuilt. By the end of July, 3 months into my tenure as CEO, the financial picture had improved dramatically. We were cash flow positive, had rebuilt most of our client relationships, and were operating with a full staff for the first time in over a year. More importantly, the company culture had completely transformed. Richard's management style had been authoritarian and fear-based. Employees competed against each other for his approval, hoarded information to protect their positions, and focused more on avoiding blame than on achieving results. I implemented a completely different approach: collaborative decision-making, transparent communication, shared accountability for results. Instead of competing against each other, employees were encouraged to support each other's success. The change was immediate and dramatic. Productivity increased, turnover dropped to almost zero, and client satisfaction scores reached levels we'd never achieved under Richard's leadership. But the real test came in August, when I found out that Richard was spreading rumors about the acquisition throughout the industry. According to several clients who mentioned it during routine check-ins, Richard was telling anyone who would listen that the acquisition had been illegitimate, that I'd used unethical tactics to force him out, that the company was doomed to fail under inexperienced leadership. He was also claiming that my pregnancy had been a deliberate manipulation, that I'd gotten pregnant specifically to create a discrimination case that would give me leverage against him. The accusations were ridiculous, but they were also potentially damaging. The consulting industry was small and reputation-driven. If enough people believed Richard's version of events, it could undermine everything I was trying to build. I had to decide how to respond. David wanted me to ignore it. "Anyone who matters will judge you by your results, not by Richard's sour grapes," he argued. "The company is thriving, your clients are happy, your employees respect you. Let your success speak for itself." Chenwei suggested a more aggressive approach. "Sue him for defamation," he said during one of our weekly strategy meetings. "Make it clear that there are consequences for spreading lies about you or the company." But I chose a third option, one that Richard probably didn't see coming. I decided to tell my story publicly. The decision to go public with my story wasn't made lightly. For weeks, I wrestled with the implications of exposing what had really happened between Richard and me. Part of me wanted to take the high road, to let my professional success speak for itself. But another part, the part that had been humiliated, betrayed, and cast aside while pregnant, wanted the world to know exactly what kind of man Richard Blackwell really was. The tipping point came when I learned that Richard had approached 3 of my newly returned clients, trying to convince them to follow him to his new consulting venture. He'd apparently started his own firm, Blackwell Strategic Solutions, and was attempting to poach both employees and clients from Pinnacle. The man who'd fired me for being an expensive liability was now trying to undermine the company I'd saved from bankruptcy. That's when I decided that silence wasn't serving anyone except Richard. I spent 2 weeks crafting my response, working with a public relations consultant to ensure that every word was carefully chosen. This wasn't going to be an emotional rant or a vindictive attack. This was going to be a professional, factual account of what had happened, told in my own voice and backed up by documentation. The piece was published on LinkedIn on a Tuesday morning in late August. I titled it simply, "From Fired Employee to Company Owner, a Story About Pregnancy Discrimination and Second Chances." I started with the facts: my 8 years at Pinnacle, my track record of success, the timing of my termination relative to my pregnancy announcement. I included screenshots of the financial records showing the company's dire situation, emails discussing the sale of the business, and documentation of the discriminatory comments Richard had made during our final meeting. But I also went beyond the legal facts to tell the human story. I wrote about the devastation of being fired while pregnant, the fear for my family's financial security, the humiliation of being escorted out by security after 8 years of dedicated service. I wrote about the sleepless nights, the tears, the sense of betrayal that cut deeper than any professional setback. And then I wrote about the decision to fight back. I could have accepted this injustice. I wrote, I could have filed a lawsuit, settled for whatever compensation I could get, and moved on with my life. Instead, I chose to bet everything on myself. I chose to turn my termination into an opportunity, my betrayal into a business plan, my pregnancy into a source of strength rather than a liability. I detailed the acquisition process, the strategic planning that had gone into the turnaround, and the results we'd achieved in just 5 months under new leadership. I included testimonials from employees who'd been rehired, clients who'd returned, and vendors who were finally being paid on time. This isn't a story about revenge, I concluded. It's a story about refusing to accept that pregnancy makes women less valuable, less committed, or less capable. It's about proving that the best response to discrimination isn't just legal action, it's demonstrable success. I hit publish at 9 a.m. and then spent the next hour throwing up from a combination of morning sickness and sheer nervousness. What I'd just done was irreversible. I'd publicly accused Richard of pregnancy discrimination, exposed his company's financial troubles, and essentially declared war on his attempt to rebuild his career. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within an hour, the post had dozens of comments from other women sharing their own experiences with pregnancy discrimination. Within 4 hours, it had been shared hundreds of times. By the end of the day, it had gone viral in the business community, with thousands of views and comments from entrepreneurs, executives, and working mothers across the country. The local business journal picked up the story within 48 hours. Then the regional papers, then the national business publications. Within a week, I was getting interview requests from major magazines and news networks, all wanting to hear more about the pregnant woman who'd bought her former company and fired her discriminatory boss. I was careful about which interviews I accepted. This wasn't about becoming famous or building a personal brand. It was about telling a story that needed to be told and protecting the business I'd worked so hard to rebuild. I focused on publications that would treat the story seriously, that would emphasize the business aspects as much as the personal drama. The interview with Harvard Business Review was particularly satisfying. The journalist, Dr. Rebecca Chen, another unrelated Chen, spent 2 hours on the phone with me discussing the strategic elements of the acquisition, the challenges of turning around a failing company, and the broader implications for workplace discrimination. "What strikes me about your story," she said near the end of our conversation, "is how you transformed a personal injustice into a business opportunity. That takes not just courage, but remarkable strategic thinking." "I had excellent motivation," I replied. "There's nothing quite like righteous anger to focus the mind." The Harvard Business Review piece ran 3 weeks later with the headline, "The Strategic Art of Revenge: How One CEO Turned Discrimination into Acquisition." It was a serious, analytical piece that positioned my story as a case study in strategic thinking and crisis management. More importantly, it established me as a legitimate business leader rather than just a victim who'd gotten lucky. But not all the coverage was positive. Richard predictably went on the offensive. He gave his own interviews to anyone who would listen, portraying himself as the victim of a vindictive scheme. He claimed that I'd manipulated the situation from the beginning, that my pregnancy had been strategically timed to create a discrimination case, and that the acquisition had been financed through family connections rather than legitimate business merit. "Sarah Chen is a talented marketer," he told one particularly sympathetic journalist, "but she's also ruthless and calculating. What she did wasn't business. It was a carefully orchestrated personal attack designed to destroy my reputation and career." The irony of Richard complaining about someone being ruthless and calculating wasn't lost on me. This was the same man who documented fictional performance issues to justify firing a pregnant employee, but I knew that his counter-narrative could be damaging if I didn't address it directly. So I did something that probably surprised him. I invited him to a public debate. The local Chamber of Commerce had reached out about having me speak at their monthly meeting about entrepreneurship and business acquisition. Instead of just giving a standard presentation, I suggested they invite Richard as well, to present both sides of the story and let the business community judge for themselves. Richard initially declined, probably assuming it was some kind of trap. But when the chamber made it clear that his refusal would be noted in their coverage of the event, he agreed to participate. The debate was scheduled for September 15th, exactly 6 months after my termination, and 4 months after taking over as CEO. By then, Pinnacle's financial turnaround was undeniable. We'd not only returned to profitability, but had exceeded our previous performance metrics. More importantly, we'd done it while treating employees fairly and maintaining ethical business practices. The Chamber's main conference room was packed that evening. Over 200 local business leaders, entrepreneurs, and professionals showed up to witness what the local paper had dubbed the Showdown at Chamber Hall. The energy in the room was electric, part professional development seminar, part gladiator arena. Richard arrived looking every inch the successful executive he'd once been. Expensive suit, confident bearing, that practiced smile that had charmed clients for years. But I could see the stress in his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands as he adjusted his tie. The past 6 months hadn't been kind to him. I, on the other hand, was 6 months pregnant and showing. I'd chosen my outfit carefully, a professional maternity dress that made my condition unmistakable, paired with the same blazer I'd worn to my first board meeting as CEO. The symbolism wasn't subtle, but it wasn't supposed to be. The Chamber President, Margaret Walsh, introduced us both with diplomatic neutrality, outlining the basic facts of the case without taking sides. Then she turned the microphone over to Richard for his opening statement. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice carrying that familiar note of authority, "what you're witnessing tonight is a cautionary tale about the dangers of mixing personal vendettas with business decisions." He spent 10 minutes painting himself as the victim of an elaborate scheme, portraying me as a manipulative employee who'd exploited pregnancy discrimination laws to orchestrate his downfall. According to his version of events, Pinnacle had been a thriving company facing minor temporary challenges when I'd launched my hostile takeover. Ms. Chen may have succeeded in destroying my reputation and stealing my company, he concluded, but she's also demonstrated that success in business isn't about ethics or fairness. It's about ruthless ambition and the willingness to destroy anyone who stands in your way. The applause was polite but muted. I could tell the audience was skeptical of his victim narrative, especially given the financial documentation that had been made public through the acquisition process. When my turn came, I stood up slowly, one hand resting on my pregnant belly, a gesture that was both natural and strategically powerful. "Richard is right about one thing," I began. "This is absolutely a cautionary tale, but not in the way he thinks." I spent the next 15 minutes walking through the timeline of events, using slides to show Pinnacle's financial decline under Richard's leadership, the pattern of discriminatory terminations, and the company's desperate search for a buyer. I presented emails, financial records, and employee testimonials that painted a picture of a failing company being run by an increasingly desperate and unethical leader. But I also talked about the human cost of Richard's decisions. I read testimonials from employees who'd been laid off, vendors who hadn't been paid, clients who'd been neglected. I talked about the pregnant woman who'd been fired because her maternity leave was seen as an unnecessary expense. "Richard wants you to believe that this story is about a vindictive employee who went too far," I said, making eye contact with various audience members. "But I would argue that this story is about accountability. It's about what happens when leaders forget that their decisions affect real people with real lives." I clicked to my final slide, Pinnacle's current financial performance, employee satisfaction scores, and client retention rates. Under Richard's leadership, Pinnacle was hemorrhaging money, losing clients, and treating employees as disposable resources. Under my leadership, we've not only returned to profitability, but achieved record performance in every metric that matters. I paused, looking directly at Richard. The question isn't whether I was too ruthless in acquiring this company. The question is whether Richard was too incompetent to deserve to keep it. The audience reaction was immediate and unmistakable. The applause was loud, sustained, and accompanied by several standing ovations. Richard's face went through several color changes as he realized that his attempt to rehabilitate his reputation had badly backfired. The Q&A session that followed was even more devastating for him. Question after question focused on his management decisions, his treatment of employees, and his failure to address Pinnacle's financial problems. When someone asked about the specific circumstances of my termination, Richard's answer was a masterclass in corporate doublespeak that fooled no one. Ms. Chen's position was eliminated as part of a broader restructuring initiative designed to optimize our operational efficiency during a period of market volatility, he said, the words sounding rehearsed and hollow. Is that why you documented fictional performance issues in her file 3 weeks after she announced her pregnancy? Asked Janet Morrison, who'd apparently decided to attend the debate. Because I worked with Sarah for 4 years and her performance was consistently exceptional. Richard's stammered response only made things worse. By the time the evening ended, it was clear to everyone in the room that his version of events simply didn't hold up to scrutiny. But the real victory came after the formal debate ended. As people were filing out of the conference room, I was approached by a steady stream of business leaders offering congratulations, sharing their own stories about workplace discrimination, and expressing interest in working with Pinnacle. 3 people offered me new clients on the spot. 2 others wanted to discuss potential partnerships. A venture capitalist mentioned that she'd been following my story and was impressed by the turnaround results. Richard, meanwhile, stood alone near the back of the room, looking like a man who'd just realized that his attempt at public redemption had turned into public humiliation. As I was gathering my presentation materials, he approached me one final time. "You've won, Sarah," he said quietly, his voice stripped of its usual confidence. "I hope you're satisfied." I looked at him for a long moment, thinking about everything that had brought us to this point. 6 months ago, he'd held all the power. He'd been the successful CEO, I'd been the disposable employee. Now the roles were completely reversed, and he was discovering what it felt like to be discarded and dismissed. "I'm not satisfied, Richard," I said finally. "Satisfaction would imply that this was about you, but it was never about you. It was about building something better than what you left behind." He stared at me, perhaps trying to think of some final comeback, some way to reclaim a shred of dignity from the wreckage of the evening. But there was nothing left to say. The debate had been decisive, and we both knew it. "Goodbye, Richard," I said, turning to leave. "I hope your new venture works out better than your old one." The drive home that night was one of the most peaceful I'd experienced in months. David had watched the debate via live stream and was practically vibrating with excitement when I walked through our front door. "That was incredible," he said, wrapping me in a careful hug that accommodated my growing belly. "You absolutely destroyed him." I presented facts and let the audience draw their own conclusions. I corrected, though I was smiling as I said it. "Same thing," he laughed. "Did you see his face when Janet asked about the performance documentation? I thought he was going to have a stroke." We spent the evening watching clips from the debate and reading reactions on social media. The consensus was overwhelmingly in my favor, with several business commentators praising my strategic thinking and others using the event as a launching point for broader discussions about pregnancy discrimination in the workplace. But the real validation came the next morning, when my phone started ringing with new business inquiries. The debate had apparently served as the world's most effective marketing campaign. Companies that had never heard of Pinnacle were suddenly interested in our services, and several competitors' clients were calling to discuss switching agencies. Within a week of the debate, we'd signed 3 new major clients and had serious discussions underway with 4 others. Our pipeline for the rest of the year was stronger than it had ever been under Richard's leadership. Richard's new venture, meanwhile, was struggling to gain traction. Word had spread quickly through the industry about the debate, and few potential clients were interested in working with someone who'd been so publicly discredited. Within 6 weeks of the chamber event, I heard through industry contacts that Blackwell Strategic Solutions had quietly shuttered its operations. Richard had tried to rebuild his career after losing Pinnacle, but the combination of his damaged reputation and my public emergence as a successful CEO had made that impossible. The man who'd fired me for being an expensive liability had become unemployable in his own industry. The irony was perfect. By October, as I entered my final month of pregnancy, Pinnacle Solutions was operating at a level of success that would have been unimaginable under Richard's leadership. We'd not only recovered from the financial crisis he'd created, but had grown beyond our previous peak performance. More importantly, we'd done it while maintaining the ethical standards and employee-focused culture that I'd implemented from day one. Our employee satisfaction scores were the highest in company history. Our client retention rate was approaching 100%. Our profit margins were strong and sustainable. The business press had taken notice. Fortune magazine included me in their 40 Under 40. List for the year, with a profile that focused on the strategic aspects of the acquisition and turnaround. Harvard Business Review published a follow-up case study examining Pinnacle's transformation as an example of crisis management and organizational change. But perhaps the most satisfying recognition came from an unexpected source. The Society for Human Resource Management named me their Executive of the Year for promoting workplace equality and demonstrating that pregnancy discrimination had real consequences for businesses that practiced it. The award ceremony was scheduled for November 10th, just 2 weeks before my due date. David was nervous about me traveling so late in my pregnancy, but I was determined to attend. This wasn't just about personal recognition. It was about sending a message to every pregnant woman who'd ever been told she was a liability to her employer. I wore a stunning maternity gown that made my condition impossible to ignore, and when I took the stage to accept the award, I could feel the energy in the room shift. Here was a woman who was literally about to give birth, accepting an award for proving that pregnancy didn't make her less capable of running a successful company. 6 months ago, I said in my acceptance speech, I was fired for being pregnant. Today, I'm being honored for proving that pregnancy discrimination isn't just morally wrong, it's bad business. I talked about the importance of creating workplaces that valued all employees, regardless of their family status. I talked about the economic benefits of supporting working mothers and the competitive advantage that came from treating employees as human beings rather than disposable resources. But I also talked about the power of refusing to accept injustice. When Richard Blackwell fired me, he thought he was solving a problem, I said. He saw my pregnancy as an expensive inconvenience that he could eliminate with a termination notice and a severance package. What he didn't realize was that he was creating a much bigger problem for himself. The audience laughed at that, but I kept my expression serious. I'm not encouraging anyone to buy their former employer's company for revenge, I continued. That's probably not a realistic option for most people. But I am encouraging everyone to refuse to accept discrimination, to fight back against injustice, and to prove through your success that the people who underestimated you were wrong. The standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes. 3 days after the award ceremony, I went into labor. Emma Chen Davis was born on November 13th at 3:47 a.m., weighing 7 pounds, 2 ounces, and screaming with the kind of righteous indignation that suggested she'd inherited her mother's fighting spirit. David cried when he first held her. I cried when I realized that this perfect little person had been the catalyst for everything that had happened over the past 9 months. Richard had seen her as a liability, an expensive problem to be eliminated. But she'd actually been the source of my greatest strength. During my 6 weeks of maternity leave, Pinnacle continued to thrive under the leadership of my deputy CEO, Marcus Chen, who'd stepped up to the role with the same dedication he'd always shown. The systems and culture I'd built were strong enough to function without my constant presence, something Richard had never been able to achieve in his years of leadership. But I found myself eager to return to work, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I'd built something I was proud of, something that reflected my values and demonstrated what was possible when businesses prioritized people over profits. When I walked back into the Pinnacle offices in early January, carrying Emma in her carrier and ready to begin my new schedule as a working mother, I was greeted by a conference room full of employees who'd gathered to welcome me back. There was cake, there were gifts for the baby, and there were genuine smiles from people who were happy to have me return. But the moment that will stay with me forever came when Jennifer from the design team approached me privately after the welcome back celebration. "Sarah," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something." When I found out I was pregnant last month, my first thought wasn't fear about how it would affect my career. It was excitement about raising a child in a world where companies like this one exist. I know that sounds dramatic, but watching you build this company while pregnant, seeing you succeed at the highest level while planning for motherhood, it's changed how I think about what's possible for working women. That's when I knew that everything I'd been through, the betrayal, the humiliation, the months of strategic planning and execution, had been worth it. Not just for me, but for every woman who would benefit from working in an environment that valued her regardless of her family status. 6 months later, I received an unexpected email. It was from Richard, reaching out through a mutual contact because he'd been blocked from contacting me directly. The message was brief. "I've been following Pinnacle's success under your leadership. I wanted you to know that I recognize now that firing you was the biggest mistake of my career. Not just because of the consequences for me, but because it was wrong. I'm sorry. I stared at the email for a long time, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Part of me was satisfied that he'd finally acknowledged what he'd done. Part of me was skeptical about his motives. Was this genuine remorse, or was he hoping for some kind of professional forgiveness that might help rehabilitate his reputation? In the end, I decided it didn't matter. Richard's apology was for him, not for me. I didn't need his recognition or remorse to validate what I'd accomplished. The success of Pinnacle, the happiness of our employees, the satisfaction of our clients, and the knowledge that I'd created a better workplace for the next generation of working mothers, those were all the validation I needed. I deleted the email without responding. Today, as I write this story, Emma is 8 months old, and Pinnacle Solutions is preparing to celebrate its most successful year in company history. We've grown from 43 employees to 87, expanded into 3 new service areas, and established ourselves as one of the most respected consulting firms in the region. More importantly, we've maintained the culture and values that I fought so hard to establish. We have generous parental leave policies, flexible work arrangements, and a commitment to supporting employees through all stages of their lives and careers. 3 more employees have had babies since I returned from maternity leave, and each one has been celebrated rather than seen as a liability. Richard, meanwhile, has left the consulting industry entirely. I heard through industry contacts that he'd moved back to his hometown and was working in his brother-in-law's insurance agency. It wasn't the kind of fall from grace that would make headlines, but it was complete. The man who'd once run a multi-million-dollar company was now processing auto insurance claims in a strip mall office. Sometimes I wonder if I went too far. Whether buying a company just to fire the person who'd wronged me was an excessive response to workplace discrimination. Whether I let my desire for revenge cloud my judgment about what was right and wrong. But then I look around the Pinnacle offices and see the thriving company we've built. I see employees who feel valued and supported. I see clients who receive exceptional service from people who are passionate about their work. I see a workplace that proves it's possible to be both successful and ethical. And I think about all the pregnant women who won't have to face what I faced, because stories like mine have made it clear that pregnancy discrimination has consequences. Not just legal consequences, but real, career-ending consequences for the people who practice it. Richard taught me that business is just business, nothing personal. But he was wrong about that. Business is always personal when it affects people's lives, their families, their futures. The decision to fire me wasn't just a business decision, it was a personal attack on my worth as a human being. My response wasn't just business either, it was deeply personal. It was about proving that the woman he'd discarded was capable of things he'd never imagined. It was about building something better than what he'd left behind. It was about ensuring that no other woman in my position would face the same injustice without consequences for the people who perpetrated it. Was it revenge? Absolutely. But it was also justice. It was also smart business. It was also the right thing to do. 6 months ago, when I first sat down to plan my response to Richard's betrayal, I told myself that success would be the best revenge. I was right about that. But what I didn't realize at the time was that the success would be even sweeter than the revenge. Building Pinnacle into the company it is today, creating a workplace that reflects my values, proving that pregnant women can be powerful leaders, those accomplishments matter more than any satisfaction I got from watching Richard's career crumble. The revenge was temporary. The success is permanent. And Emma, the little girl who was once seen as an expensive liability, gets to grow up in a world where her mother is the CEO of a thriving company that proves pregnancy doesn't make women less valuable, less committed, or less capable of extraordinary things. Sometimes the best revenge isn't just getting even. Sometimes it's building something so much better than what came before that the original injustice becomes irrelevant. Sometimes it's proving that the person who underestimated you made the worst mistake of their career. Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to let them win. Richard Blackwell fired me for being pregnant. I bought his company, fired him, and built it into something he never could have imagined. In the end, his biggest mistake wasn't discriminating against a pregnant employee. His biggest mistake was discriminating against me. And now everyone knows it.